Hello and welcome. My name is Tom Clues. I'm the Executive Director and founder of Crossing Borders Music. We're so glad to spend this afternoon with you here. That was beautiful music sung by Carolina Gomez, a beautiful performance, beautiful piece. It was written by a early 19th century Chicago composer who was a Colombian immigrant, Eustasio Rosales. He was celebrated in his lifetime, and unfortunately in the 85 years or so since he passed away, his music has languished in storage. So you're one of the first living people to hear that piece of music and all the music on the program today. In fact, there will be some music that, as far as we know, has not been performed in any living person's lifetime today. So it's a special day for that reason, and a special day for another reason. We have Eustasio's great-grandson with us, a filmmaker, Arlen Parsa, a fellow Chicagoan. Welcome, Arlen.
Hey, Tom. Great to be with you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for holding this event.
It's awesome to have you here with us. You are a filmmaker, and you made, in fact, a documentary about your great-grandfather, Eustasio, The Way to Andina, and you kind of chronicled your journey learning about your great-grandfather's opera, and in fact, staging that opera here in Chicago. It wasn't performed in his lifetime. He wrote it, and he had an untimely death. He passed away before it was performed, and so you staged that first performance. It's a remarkable story.
Yeah, this was a really wild adventure, especially for a person who knows nothing about opera, right? Knows nothing about music. So kind of learning that there was kind of this musical past in my family tree and trying to bring that to life, it was quite an adventure.
So is that something that you sort of grew up knowing about your great-grandfather Eustasio, or was there a certain moment where you realized that he had been a celebrated composer?
So this was kind of one of those things that I grew up kind of knowing in the back of my head. You know, there was somebody in my family tree who had something to do with music. Didn't really know what exactly. I had never heard the music. Nobody who's alive today had ever heard, you know, the music that he had written. It was just kind of this thing that we all knew about, but he died long, long before, you know, I was born or my parents were born. So it was just kind of this lingering thing. Now, what happened a couple years ago was my grandmother passed away. My grandmother was his daughter, and she was kind of the last person alive to know him. And when she passed away, that kind of sent the whole family into a mode of reflection. And one night, my mother went on YouTube, or actually she went on just Google, and she was just searching for names, family names. And she ended up searching for the name of this ancestor of hers, Eustasio Rosales. She searched for that, and what came up was YouTube links. And it turned out that people were performing his music completely unbeknownst to our family. People had been performing his music, not knowing anything about his story, but his music was alive. And this was a huge shock to the family, right? You could imagine never having heard this music of sort of this long-lost ancestor, And then all of a sudden these people have this music and they're performing it. And that was really wild. And so we kept watching these YouTube videos, and it was always the same song called Bolero, which you can find on YouTube, many, many different versions of Eustasio Rosales' Bolero. And we were fascinated to hear just this one song. And we, really started thinking, well, gosh, this one song is apparently good enough that people are performing it, 100 years after he wrote it. What about the rest of his music? And could we bring some of that back? Maybe there would be interest in that as well. So one day, my Aunt Deborah invited me over to her house, and we went down to the basement, and we found this box that was just packed to the brim of music. And we have a clip from the documentary that I think we're going to watch in a moment. And what you'll see me going to her house, and we've got these big boxes of music, and we're just going to start looking through them and seeing what we find. So I think if we could watch that clip, you'll get a sense of what that moment was like, really understanding kind of a little more about this musical legacy and starting to think about what could we do with this music. So let's take a look.
Here we go, down here.
This is my aunt right here. I'm at her house today because she has something she wants to show me.
Okay, back here is where we have Eustasio's music. I have 2 boxes.
Wow.
Here and here.
Okay. Well, let's take them upstairs and see what we've got here.
Okay, good.
Boy, it's kind of heavy, actually.
Yeah, it is.
The heavy stuff in those boxes is sheet music written by my great-grandfather. What is all this?
Well, this is memorabilia. Oh my God, look at this old thing. This is very old. I don't know how much time you want to spend on it. There's an awful lot of stuff here. Look at this beautiful picture of my grandfather, Eustasio Rosales. Maestro Rosales, master of music.
Wow.
This is the manuscript for his opera, Andina.
Holy cow.
Yeah,
So this is like the opera that he wrote?
this is the opera that he wrote.
So this is probably the only copy of this that exists in the world. It's handwritten.
You're absolutely right. Piccolo, flute, oboe, clarinets, bassoon, horns, trumpets, tuba, timpani.
So it sounds like this opera has been passed down from generation to generation in our family.
My mother always felt guilty that she wasn't able to shop the music to someone. And I feel bad about it too. I took it over thinking maybe I could, but it's a big job. There's a lot of music. I don't know the classical world either, or how to get it out there. Looks impressive here. I have no idea. I'd love to hear a concert, even a tiny little bit of it, see what it was like, hear the voices singing. That would be an amazing thing.
What a touching clip. I have to ask, Arlen, how did it feel when you first heard the piece Bolero, which was published and was available? I have to say, as a classical musician, it makes such a big deal which pieces and which scores, which compositions are available to us and published and easily accessible, and which ones are in somebody's basement in the Chicago suburbs that we have no idea exist. And so therefore that music essentially dies, like all of the music that we'll hear today. But how did it feel to hear that first YouTube clip of your great-grandfather's music?
I was in disbelief, just as I think, my mom and my aunt were in disbelief, because we always kind of assumed, to the extent that we knew the story, it was that when he died, his music died with him. Right? So there was an element of shock, certainly. There was also an element of like, this is actually maybe surprisingly listenable. At least this is my own, speaking for myself. Like it was a listenable piece. You could even if you were not into classical music, it had some kind of cool little flourishes. That particular piece that was on YouTube, Eustasio Rosales' Bolero, people can find it. It's a piece for marimba. So these giant xylophone-like instruments, and they're hitting them with mallets, and it's kind of fun. Apparently, in the 1940s, we think. We have newspaper clippings from the 1940s. They played this song with something like 100 different marimbas in a giant open-air concert in Chicago. So I can't even imagine what that would have been like. But at least for me, hearing just a very small audience of 3 people on YouTube, that was a pretty special moment in and of itself.
Awesome. Well, I hope that today is a special moment for you and your family, who I understand are there with you in your home today. We're going to hear, we saw the pictures of those boxes. You and I went with the wonderful Chicago musician, Johanna Ortegon, the founder of the the Ortegon School of Music and Mulati Ensemble, some wonderful organizations. The 3 of us went one morning sifting through those boxes that we saw in that video and discovered some music that has never been performed in living memory. And this is one of those pieces. You'll be one of the first people alive to hear. Everybody watching will be the first people alive to hear this piece that I think does have some of those Latin influences. So this is the serenade for violin and piano. It's performed by Rasa Mahmoudian and Marianne Parker, our very own at Crossing Borders Music. And this is essentially a world premiere performance. Let's take a look at this performance.
That was a great piece.
All right, beautiful. Yeah, beautiful performance. Thank you, Rasa, for that performance. Yeah, beautiful and just kind of charming piece. And like you said, it's Arlen, it's fun. You can get into it. It's sort of Of course, like his bolero. Of course, this is probably your first time ever hearing that piece. It's all of our first times ever hearing that piece. How does
it was gorgeous and so beautifully performed. I have to say, by those musicians, that was just really a treat to hear. Beautiful music.
Thank you, Rasa and Marianne. Thank you also to the First Unitarian Church of Chicago for providing that beautiful and resonant space to us. We're so grateful to have been able to perform this music there. Arlen, as you went through this process of learning about your great-grandfather and making this documentary, you learned about his history and his life in Chicago. And in fact, we have another clip from your documentary. Would you like to tell us a bit about it?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So, for me, this was kind of a journey of discovering this music and deciding to ultimately perform it. So we ended up doing a one-night-only opera performance in Chicago of this long-lost opera that he had written some 80 years earlier that had been in boxes, kind of passed down from generation to generation. But step one in that journey was learning what we could learn about the composer himself and about his life. He was an immigrant originally from Colombia, so he came to the United States. Originally, he came here for the Chicago World's Fair. But then he came here several years later as an immigrant. Clearly, the city of Chicago was very appealing to him. He had been here once before. He decided, I'm going to come here. This was kind of an exciting place, a place where music was happening, and he wanted to be at the center of that action. So in this clip, we'll see a couple of interviews with my mother and my aunt, and they're kind of relaying to me some of the information that they know about him. And then we kind of went back and retraced some of those footsteps back to the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, which is a place that premiered one of his works in the early 1930s. So if we take a look at that clip, you'll get a sense of kind of how I'm just sort of learning as a baby, trying to put together some of the pieces and trying to understand this story. So let's take a look at that clip.
My grandfather, he was Colombian. They were a prominent family, apparently, but I don't think that his family's position was particularly important to him. He started writing music at a young age. Music brought him to the U.S.
Apparently, Eustasio wound up in Chicago and started making new music in his new home.
Eustasio was the first Latin American composer who had music played at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. That was a very big deal.
Deborah mentioned that Eustasio's music had been performed at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra.
In this room, we house all of the materials that document the history of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra Association.
Frank Villella is in charge of the CSO's archives.
Yeah, the materials date back to the mid-19th century.
We're kind of looking for my great-grandfather's music.
Rosales was his last name?
Rosales was his name.
The orchestra would have performed this work, Rosales' 3 Spanish dances, on 2 occasions. Take a look down the row to find the program books. So that would be the 42nd season, 1932-33. These are all the programs from that season. There it is.
There it is.
It's the first performance.
Eustasio Rosales, born 1875 in Bogota, Colombia. Excerpts from an opera, Andina, were performed at a school concert in 1930. Doesn't say anything more about this opera of his.
I also looked up on our microfilm a review of the concert. Rosales' dances applauded. His newest work is brilliant and was fervently applauded. He responded with numerous bows to very insistent and spontaneous applause. That's a very good review for a premiere of a new work.
I love that. You know, it's amazing, really, to find out about this history. He was a celebrated composer in his lifetime, like we saw performed by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra at a time in which they really didn't perform music by Latin American composers. He was the first one, as I understand.
Yeah, we believe that he was the first Latin American composer to have music premiered at the CSO. So this was a personal triumph for him, one of the highlights of his career. unfortunately, about a year after this performance, he ended up dying unexpectedly. He was in his 50s at this time, so his career was still on the upswing, but definitely the family wonders, how well known would his name be, perhaps, in the classical music world if he hadn't died, in an unexpected way. But certainly the relationship between Dr. Stock and him was an important one.
Yeah,
Dr. Stock being, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's music director at the time.
Exactly. Yes, and in fact, I was checking the dates of the subscription series performance of Eustasio's work on the Chicago Symphony Orchestra season, and in fact, it's the very same season as the Chicago Symphony Orchestra performed for the first time of any major orchestra, work by a Black woman, an African-American woman, Florence Price, who was also a Chicagoan, in the 32-33 season, 1932-1933 season. So a couple of firsts in that season. Now, I don't know the circumstances around the performance of Eustasio's work, but I do know in that very famous premiere of Florence Price's symphony, the way in which it was presented, on the one hand, it was a groundbreaking achievement, and on the other hand, the way in which her symphony was presented tells you a lot about the unfortunate kinds of attitudes that she was working against at that time. She was programmed alongside another composer who was a well-known white supremacist and eugenicist right before her symphony. Yeah, so I can't help but wonder in what ways his Latin American identity may have worked against him at that time. He was certainly trailblazing and was able to, accomplish so much and be in his lifetime. Or maybe it's a factor in why we really don't know about his works today. What I do know is you've told me a bit, Arlen, about how he was able to sort of use his Colombian identity, and he knew that people saw him as sort of an exotic foreigner, and he was actually able to use that to his advantage, as I understand.
That's right. There's a story that's kind of been passed down from generation to generation in our family. He was the conductor of a nightclub. It was a nightclub on our rooftop. So he had a band on the top of a Chicago hotel. The hotel is no longer there. It was the LaSalle Hotel. And so he would perform music up there. This was back in perhaps the 1920s. And I believe the act was marketed as Senor Rosales' Latin Band. And he was the only one from South America. The rest of them, I think, were perhaps Germans or Italians. But they all kind of had these mustaches, and it was kind of assumed that perhaps this would be a good marketing idea. So I think there were times at which, he was able to kind of leverage his identity and his origin in a way that could sort of be, marketable or exciting or fresh or different from some of the things that perhaps Chicagoans had been familiar with. So there was definitely, there's a double-edged sword there. And I think even at that time, there was an opportunity to kind of use that and appeal to people, but it probably there may have also been drawbacks, discrimination as well.
Yeah, it's also so interesting for me to see how at times he draws on his Colombian cultural heritage and uses those elements in his music. I heard some of that in the Serenade, and his opera, as I understand, is set in Colombia. On the other hand, the song that we heard, A Mother to Her Son, an English language song, and in fact, we are about to hear another song, again featuring Carolina Gomez and Marianne Parker on piano, accompanying Carolina. This is the song The Tyger, and it's based on poetry of the same name by the English poet William Blake. This is a classic poem, The Tyger, and it asks, how could a god who creates a creature as fierce and destructive and powerful as a tiger also create something so gentle and peaceful as the lamb? How could the same God create both? And it sort of speaks to our dual nature, or our potential for good and evil. There's a lot of symbolism that you can imagine here. And what I find so fascinating, again, is that here's Eustasio going back and forth between these sort of different cultural worlds, the English poet, the classic English poet, and then at other times drawing on that Colombian identity. So let's hear this, in my mind, really beautiful, stunningly beautiful and evocative music that really tells the story of the poem, makes the words come alive through the music. Again, Carolina and Marianne, Eustasio Rosales, The Tyger. I love the music that describes the tiger that's so ferocious, with the piano running, the fingers running up and down the keyboard, and the singing that's almost like a scream. I think it's really evocative music, and then the contrast in the middle with the section about the lamb. I really, really like that piece.
And performed so beautifully. I have to say, you know, these performances that you've put together are absolutely terrific. All these musicians have a tremendous amount of talent and skill. And I have to say, this is the prettiest music that I've ever heard sung with somebody wearing a mask. So it's terrific that we're able to do that right now. In these times, you're able to make it happen.
And a special shout out and appreciation to Carolina Gomez for singing so beautifully with a mask on. Thank you, Marianne and Carolina. We really appreciate your artistry in that piece. Arlen, it's also such a pleasure to be here with you and ask you questions. I wanted to mention to everybody who is watching, if you have questions for Arlen, please do put those in the chat, and we will get them. And so you can ask Arlen your questions right now as we're live. Our wonderful Crossing Borders Music board member, Savi Chorm, is behind the scenes, and she's going to relay those questions to us. So we will get them. So please do put your questions for Arlen in the chat. While you're doing that, again, I find it so interesting how Eustasio sort of goes back and forth, almost just like he's wading through water so freely between music that has these European influences. It's a European tradition, and also drawing on his Colombian roots. And there's a bit of that sort of the importance of those influences in a very short clip that we're about to see again from your documentary. Do you have anything to let us know before we watch that to introduce this?
I think you did a good job of introducing it. I think this was kind of a tightrope that, you know, he would balance on, kind of which part of his identity he was going to draw upon, or what type of music he was going to pursue. So let's take a look at this clip.
Eustasio, being a Latin American immigrant, was a huge part of his identity, not just as a citizen, but as a composer too. In the early 20th century, he helped Chicagoans learn the tango. The songs that he wrote mixed classical musical instruments with Latin ones that Americans hadn't heard before.
A very short clip, it mentions mixing of these instruments in the same piece. How did you find out about that, and what's that about?
Yeah, certainly. Well, you know, in the opera that we ended up performing, this opera Undina, there's definitely, you can, very distinctive Latin-influenced rhythms in that, in some sections in particular. So there's a piece of that. You know, there's also a story that I believe has been passed down in our family about when Rosales had some of this music performed at the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. I believe, you know, he had the composer had some ideas about castanets being used in some sections, and I think Dr. Stock, the CSO's music director, was not quite so interested in doing things quite that way. So there's a little bit of back and forth, perhaps professionally, but you know, it's interesting to listen to how some of his music was so clearly influenced in that way, and other parts of his music he was going for a more traditional European style, classical.
Yeah, interesting to hear about the resistance to castanets. I can just imagine him saying, "This is not a serious instrument that we use here at the symphony,"
Right.
And fighting those sorts of stodgy, Eurocentric attitudes about what a proper instrument for the symphony might be.
Dr. Stock, I think, was German, so there may have been some of that.
And thank goodness that his work was able to be performed despite that. We have a question from a listener, a watcher. How difficult was it to abstract the music from the old manuscripts? That is a really great question. And Arlen, if it's okay, maybe I should answer as one of the performers.
Go ahead, please do.
Who was involved. So in many cases, the music well, in all the cases, the music was handwritten because of the time period from which it came. In general, most of the scores were in decent shape. In other words, they were legible and we could tell what the notes were, but we did have somebody go through and sort of read that handwritten manuscript and put that into kind of modern electronic notation generated through a computer. Actually, Arlen, in your documentary, you speak about doing the same thing for the opera. Is that something that the performers had requested of you?
Well, you know, it would have been pretty difficult, pretty challenging to perform otherwise. Yeah, so there's definitely, most of it, I think, the handwriting was legible, and he had a very clear idea, but there were a couple areas where we had to solve some mysteries in the score, and I know that you're familiar with doing that too. Sometimes there are places where either the handwriting is too small or something gets crossed out and replaced, and you have to kind of figure out how those jigsaw pieces fit together. So it's an interesting kind of musical detective work. I'm not obviously the one who does that. You all and the experts who know music are people who do that, but I'm fascinated by the process.
Indeed. And in fact, this would be a great time to mention, if there are any music scholars watching, there's basically a treasure trove of music that's unexplored, has yet to be written about, has yet to be set in its historical context. And there are even some very large questions of where does this 30 seconds worth of music go? Does it go before this section or after this section? Things like that that sometimes come up. There will be, you know, some measures that are crossed out and maybe an arrow pointing to something else, and then another random sheet that doesn't seem to fit with anything else. It was obviously clear in Eustasio's lifetime, but now, you know, without the benefit of him to ask questions to figure out exactly what he meant, there's a lot of work to be done, and really it would be an amazing project for a scholar, be an amazing doctoral thesis. So Arlen, how should somebody contact you if they happen to be a scholar interested in exploring this music?
Sure, yeah, we're certainly open to inquiries. If people go to my website, arlenparsa.com, there's a link to contact me. And I'd love to hear from folks who are perhaps scholars and might be interested in this project. Yeah, it certainly is. We have a couple of boxes full of music, and a lot of it is stuff that hasn't seen the light of day. So there's definitely gold in them there hills, I guess you could say.
Yeah, still many scores that haven't been performed in living history. So this next piece is one of those pieces that had not been performed in living history, and also one of those pieces where a lot of those kinds of questions came up. Which measure, where does this section of music go? Does it go before or after this other section? So we are also want to acknowledge one scholar who has been working with us and who's very interested and involved in this project, Professor Luis Carlos Rodriguez Alvarez in Antioquia in Colombia. A wonderful treasure trove of information on Colombian composers, a wonderful resource, and he's been so helpful to us, and also just a wonderful connection to have, and really great scholar, valuable resource to have. So thank you, Professor. And without further ado, we've talked so much about this violin sonata that we've pieced together. Here is again, you'll be one of the first living people to hear this performance. This is, again, our violinist Rasa Mahmoudian and pianist Marianne Parker performing Eustasio's violin sonata. Beautiful performance. Thank you again, Ressa Mahmoudian and Marianne Parker. I found myself, as I became familiar with that piece, hearing it rehearsed and recorded, it kept on going through my head. Some beautiful, catchy tunes and very accessible to your point, Arlen. This is not music, written for scholars. This is music for everybody to enjoy, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be stuck in my head too a little bit as well. It's a joy listening to that. And I have to say, it's not only beautiful music, but it's also beautifully performed. I'm not a musician myself, but just listening to that and watching their dedication to their craft as this long, 15-minute long piece that you have to perform and try not to make any mistakes. It's almost like running a musical marathon. And obviously you can imagine if you have a full orchestra that can kind of mask any mistake that somebody might make. But when it's just two performers like that, boy, the pressure's on, and they did an absolutely beautiful job. I'm so impressed.
Indeed. Thank you both, Ressa and Marianne. Arlen, as you were making this documentary, I think you made a number of interesting discoveries, but you mentioned there was something that gave you pause as you were listening to tapes of your grandmother.
That's right. Part of this, again, half of the journey was learning about the music and getting ready to put that music to the test and a performance. But the other half was kind of learning about Rosales, the composer, his life, right? What was it like, kind of understanding the contours of his own personal journey. So, he was an immigrant from Colombia, and one thing that surprised me, we had these great oral history tapes from my grandmother Paula, and she kind of talks about her memories of her father and kind of some of the issues that he struggled with. And one of the things that was really fascinating and interesting to me, she mentions, is he talks about how there was a problem with his, he married an American woman, and there was a problem with her citizenship status. So I think if we watch the clip, we'll get a sense for kind of some of the challenges that he had as an immigrant coming to the United States in the early 20th century and kind of what some of those struggles were. So let's take a look at that clip.
Thing that Paula said in these tapes that gave me pause.
My mother married her husband from Colombia. She lost her citizenship when she did that. She was no longer a citizen of the United States.
Could this really be true? Did my great-grandmother lose her American citizenship simply because she married an immigrant? Or is it possible my grandmother was misremembering things?
I have lost some of my ability to think very straight at this age.
I need to find out more. It turns out a few years before Mary and Eustasio got hitched, Congress passed a law that took away American women's citizenship when they married immigrants. All of Mary's rights, along with the rights of thousands of other American women, vanished. Mary was evidently a political junkie. The family always talked politics around the dinner table, and we still have newspaper clippings that she saved decades ago. So I have to imagine that it must have been shattering when she learned that she herself would not be able to vote, just as other American women were casting their first ballots after the 19th Amendment passed.
Yeah, and so Arlen, this must have been quite a shock as you were doing your research. I myself was never aware of this law.
That's right. Yeah, there's so much in U.S. immigration law and the history of it that's fascinating and sometimes shocking to look at in retrospect. And so I wanted to include this little piece of Eustasio's family journey, his immigration story, in the film because, it feels like immigration is always a timely subject these days. And it's important to understand how much in some ways, our laws have changed and we've come a long way. But in other ways, we still have a long ways to go with how we're dealing with this issue. This was certainly one of those surprising things to learn about. And what's interesting is while I was on this journey of making the film and getting the music performed, the U.S. Congress actually passed an apology for the Expatriation Act that caused my grandmother and thousands of other American women to lose their citizenship when they married foreign-born men. So it was kind of an interesting little coda to that story of kind of putting an end to that type of practice.
And so you mentioned this is a law that affected American women who married foreign-born men. It's only women who were affected when they got married. This wouldn't apply.
That's right. You've got it exactly right. Yes, it wouldn't. If a woman came to the United States as an immigrant and married an American-born man, he would not lose his citizenship. It was a one-way street. Yeah.
Fascinating, and an important history that I was completely ignorant of until watching your documentary. That was quite a surprise. Gave me pause as well as you when I heard that statement. I was completely unaware of that.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, 100 years from now, perhaps people will look back upon our laws today and feel the same way. Yeah, we'll see.
Right. Right. I want to remind everyone who's watching, again, please put your questions for Arlen in the chat. We would love to ask him whatever is on your mind. This is your chance to speak to Eustasio's great-grandson and a wonderful filmmaker, a really great documentary film. Actually, we have a question coming in right now. What is the biggest lesson or piece of inspiration that you've taken away from the process about learning about your great-grandfather Eustasio?
Great question. I think one thing that really sticks out in his story is, looking at some of the letters and some of the correspondence that we have from his life, and even after he died, was kind of never giving up, right? For instance, he wrote this opera, Undina, and struggled for years trying to get it performed, right? And he wrote the music, but his brother, who still lived in Colombia, wrote the lyrics. And so we have these letters from back and forth, these telegrams talking about, could we get it performed this way? Could we get these people interested? And they kind of never gave up. And so kind of that spirit of not giving up and sticking to your guns, that's kind of an inspirational story, I think, to anybody who has kind of an artistic sensibility and wants to make things happen in that way. So that was definitely inspirational, kind of the power of sticking to it and not giving up.
And it seems like you learned that lesson and also learned just how difficult it is to stage an opera. Again, in your documentary, you go into a lot of detail about all that entails and all the challenges of putting together an opera. There are so many people involved.
That's right. And I have to give great credit to all of the collaborators on that journey. I am not the expert, but we had a wonderful team led by Chris Ramakers, a wonderful conductor, and he put together with the Chicago Composers Orchestra and these fantastically talented singers and other performers, and we brought in theater professionals, and it was a really wonderful journey. So I was kind of along for the ride as somebody who know nothing about this process, but it was fascinating to kind of learn a little bit of that world as well.
Well, you're very modest, because I know, again, from watching the film, that indeed you were sort of the organizer pulling the strings to make it all happen, and we're glad that you did. What an incredible journey to be able to rediscover these works of your great-grandfather. And in fact, in that performance of his opera, I have to mention a wonderful violinist, former Crossing Borders founding Crossing Borders violinist, Maya Shiraishi, was the concertmaster in that opera orchestra.
So talented. My gosh, to hear her play, just an absolute gift.
Yeah, absolutely. We have another question. Is there a listing of Eustasio Rosales' works online?
Yeah, we're working on that. We do have a bunch more music, and we'd love to make this accessible in some sort of way. So we have a website that has some information, doesn't have all the information, but we're working on slowly adding more as time goes on. That's at eustasiorosales.com. Also, if you just search on Google for Eustasio Rosales, you'll find that website. We're slowly putting together some works, and if you'd like to reach out to me, I can provide you with a private, more complete list that hasn't been published yet.
Got you. And so people, musicians especially, who might want to reach out to you, or again, I'll put a plug out there for music scholars interested in studying this music. Clearly a lot to go through. How can people contact you again, Arlen?
Absolutely. They can visit my website, arlenparsa.com, or you could just search on me, search on Google for my name, Arlen Parsa, and you'll find a contact link, and you could just send me an email, and I'll provide you with more information.
Lots of music that has still yet to be shared and performed despite both of our efforts. There it is, arlenparsa.com. Wonderful. Please let us know any final questions that you have for Arlen during this, our last musical piece. And we have another question coming in before we get to that. Where was Eustasio trained?
Sure, absolutely. So I don't know the specific name of the school, but from what we understand, Rosales came from a family that had some wealth, and he was recognized at an early age as a musical prodigy. And in fact, he wrote his first piece for orchestra at a very young age. I don't have it in front of me, but I believe he was a young teenager, something like 12 or 13 or something like that. So he kind of displayed this talent. I unfortunately cannot say exactly where he trained. He came to the United States as a young man in his 20s, though. So he would have completed his training down in Colombia.
I see. So he studied music in Colombia before coming here to Chicago, and we're not sure yet of the name of the school. Again, a great opportunity for scholarship for an interested
That's
scholar.
right. Yeah, we know he lived in Bogota, and he was involved with the National Symphony Orchestra down in Colombia at that time. Yeah. So there's probably paperwork somewhere that has yet to be discovered.
Gotcha. A call out to musicians in Bogota who are interested in exploring those archives. Indeed. Another question coming in. Have you been able to connect to any of Rosales's relatives in Colombia as you went through the process of rediscovering his music?
That's a really great question. You know, the story in my family had been that everybody on the Colombian side of the family had died out. That there was no more of the lineage, nobody to be contacted. However, 1 week after we came out with the documentary film, I got a message on Facebook from somebody, and it turns out they did not die out. They were thrilled to see the documentary, and that was kind of a wonderful little connection that we made there. So we've been in touch with one of my relatives down there, and it's been fun having kind of this cross-continental exchange of music. Also with a professor, Luis Carlos, down there, sending him some music. So it's been a wonderful collaboration. A couple of years ago, we actually took that piece, Three Spanish Dances. This is the piece that Rosales had written for the Chicago Symphony Orchestra here in the United States. And we actually sent that music down to Colombia and had one of their large orchestras down in Bogota perform that piece. And so my Colombian side of the family were able to attend that concert, and so that was a wonderful round trip for kind of some of his music, making it all the way back down there.
That is fascinating, Arlen. It really excites me to hear about all that you initiated and all the things that came out of your project, making that documentary and staging that opera. And it also makes me excited to wonder what possibilities and connections will come through our event today. It's very exciting to be sort of history.
You make a really good point, and I have to say I can't take all the credit, except for doing the opera. Really, all of this has happened because people have contacted me, right? So if anybody's listening, they want to make something happen, contact me, and we'll see what we can do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Arlen. Well, speaking of that, that's exactly what we did, exploring the archives with you. And this last piece that we have to share is one of my favorites, though honestly, they're all my favorites. This is his string quartet. As far as we know, it's in 3 movements. So there's a fast movement to begin with, which is typical for string quartets, a slow second movement, also typical for string quartets, what's called a scherzo, which in Italian means joke, so kind of a light-hearted, dance-like third movement. And then often a string quartet would then have a fourth movement, but as far as we can tell, and as far as the archives have, there are just 3 movements. I love that piece. It was such a joy to make that music together with my colleagues, Jennifer Leckie on violin, Rasa Mahmoudian on violin, Jay Pike on viola, and myself, Tom Clues, on cello. It was so exciting to watch that music. And we have two special guests with us. Arlen, I understand there's been sort of a watch party at your household.
That's right. You know, the stars aligned perfectly. So I have my mother, Susan, and my aunt, Deborah, here. They were both watching the concert downstairs. I'm told enjoying it.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
How does it feel to hear Eustasio's music?
Well, you know, since he died so long ago, my mother was a teenager when he passed away. We only knew of him through her stories. We have an opportunity now, thanks to Arlen, to know much more of his history and his life, thanks to the wonderful performers that you've had on this program who have brought his music to life in a way that you can't imagine how moving this is for us. These were things about our grandfather we never could have appreciated without what Arlen did, what you have done to bring this alive, and these performers, really, we can't thank you enough. This has just been an incredible experience for us at this point in our lives to finally know something about not only what he wrote and gave as our grandfather, but the influence and impact he might have had in his life, the people who knew him and he interacted with and so on. And we just have a better idea of this now. And it means all the world to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I remember being at your home, as we saw in the clip of the documentary, looking over some.
We were at Deborah's home. Yeah.
Oh, excuse me. At your.
Another one.
Yes, and I remember looking over some scores and starting to sing, and it was just amazing to take what had been sort of a dead document in a certain sense and making it come to life, even just looking at the music on the page and singing the tune to hear it out loud.
Yeah, it's so true. The Tyger song, I can remember so many times as a younger person going to that box, looking at that. I'm an English lit major. I love William Blake, and seeing that and wondering what that sounded like. To hear Carolina sing it today, oh my gosh, it's just really something special, Tom.
It brought us to tears.
Yeah.
It brought us.
Well, thank you so much for allowing us to share the music of your grandfather. It's a privilege and a responsibility that I'm glad you entrusted to us. I know I've been saying this all day, all broadcast, but if there are musicians, scholars out there, this is really some fascinating and beautiful music that really deserves to be explored. And heard and shared, and so that people can share in that beauty and that expression. If there are any last questions, this is your final moments for the family. And also, I have a whole bunch of people to thank. I want to thank all of you for being here with us, especially sort of unexpectedly joining into this live stream broadcast. We're so glad to have you here.
We're thrilled that we happen to be here at this moment.
It was the stars were shining down on us today. What a neat family experience. Arlen, thank you so much for your insights and your being really the person to champion this cause of bringing this long-lost music to life, and for sharing all that you have with us here today, as well as your art itself from your documentary. We also want to thank
great. This is a great program. Thank you for putting it on.
Thank you.
Thank you. We also want to thank Johanna Ortegon for help facilitating that discovery of the music, Professor Luis Carlos Rodriguez Alvarez at the University of Antioquia. We want to thank the wonderful videography of Aidan Kranz. And the sound by Mew Marita, a wonderful, wonderful sound engineer and videography. Savi Chorm, the Crossing Borders Music Board member, is behind the scenes fielding those questions in. We also want to thank Taveri Crouch, who's also behind the scenes operating the tech for this live stream, putting up a link to our website right now. Thank you, Taveri. We want to thank all of our performers, including Rasa Mahmoodian, Jay Pike on viola, myself, Tom Clues on cello, Jennifer Leckie on violin, and our special guest artist, Carolina Gomez. We want to thank those who have helped make today possible with funding, including all of our contributors and those institutional funders, including the Illinois Humanities, who helped make this project possible and helped bring Arlen here with us today, and the Illinois Arts Council. Lastly, I want to thank First Unitarian. There's a lot of people to thank. First Unitarian Church for their gracious use of that beautiful space and resonant acoustics. We couldn't have done it without all of those people. Whew, that was a lot of people to think. It's really a community effort, and the wonderful community supporting Crossing Borders Music. Crossing Borders Music is a nonprofit organization with the mission of using music to promote the dignity of people from all cultures. We focus on music by composers from underrepresented cultures. To learn more, go to that website that you just saw, www.crossingbordersmusic.org, or follow us on Facebook and Instagram, Crossing Borders Music. I think that's it. Thank you so much, Rosales, granddaughters and great-grandson. Thank you to everybody for making this event possible.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.